When you say something about somebody's language, or you make a comment about somebody's language or whatever, you're really you're not just making a comment about their language, right? You're often making a comment about their class or about their
Yeah.
race. It's never just about accent bias, it's about addressing some of the structural
Right.
forms of inequality that pervade our institutions at the same time. If your starting point is working with a theory of social justice, which makes this assumption that systemic inequality can be solved purely through some kind of linguistic intervention, then your theory of change for social justice is inevitably flawed.
All right, so today we have Ian Cushing from Manchester Metropolitan University. Ian is a senior lecturer in critical applied linguistics. So welcome, Ian. Thank you
Hello.
for joining me for this conversation. We're going to talk about, for about half an hour or so. The first question, Ian, is the question I tend to ask to my guests all the time is, what made you become an academic? Why did you become an academic and a researcher?
Okay. Um, so many reasons.
Yes.
Like, what I was thinking of, I was asked this very question. I was doing a talk for some A-level English language students just a couple of weeks ago. So for those outside the UK, A-level English language is like the age, like students who are between 16 to 18 who are taking different courses, and English language is one of them. And like I was asked this question, and I thought, oh, what are the origins of this? Like, where can I trace these things? Like all of my work is about like tracing origins of things.
Right.
It was interesting for me to think about that question in relation to how I find myself within academia. And you know what? I think you can trace it all the way back to my own experiences of uh, school as a student in secondary school. So when I was about 11 to 12, and I grew up in a working class community just outside of Manchester in northern England. And very racially diverse, very multilingual, little part of the city. And I have these distinct memories of my experience of school being a space where if you spoke a certain way, or even if you used a certain language, whatever you did with your language, if that kind of fell outside these like expected, like institutionalized conventions about
Mm,
so-called appropriate language use.
yeah.
If you were someone that used language differently, then you were marked out as different, like maybe by your teachers or maybe by your classmates, right? And that kind of ran along. This is like in the early 90s.
Mm,
And that like ran alongside like a wider like media and political narrative that there are certain ways that people should use language in schools. And I always found that to be quite unjust, like what I saw within school. But my parents also really encouraged me to have conversations about injustice and inequality. And that was something that they lived, and that was something that as a child I was always, I was kind of prompted to like spot inequalities in society. And so right from a really young age, like I feel like I was quite attuned to that.
It's quite interesting that this kind of interest goes back to your early years in education. You're
Yeah.
talking about these expectations that students had to speak in a particular way, and if they didn't, they were, somehow it was marked. Was it something that was in your memory? Was this something that affected most of the students in, say, in your classroom or in your area, or was it? Or not? Was it tied to social class perhaps, or even, what
Yeah.
what were the variables that made it more likely that some of the pupils would be marked as
Sure.
non-standard in the way that they spoke?
Yeah. I mean, it was absolutely tied to social class, and that intersected pretty closely with race as well, as it continues to do so today. And I think those early experiences and those early encounters with linguistic inequalities have never really left me really, because that tells us so much about how when you say something about somebody's language, or you make a comment about somebody's language or whatever, you're really making, you're not just making a comment about their language, right? You're often making a comment about their class or about their race.
Yeah.
So yeah, those experiences of school led me eventually to become a school teacher. So I was a school teacher, and that was like, what, I don't know, 20 years after that or something. But
Yeah.
I witnessed the same things happening. Like, I was like, God, like the things that they were like baked into my memory as a kid, I'm still witnessing those same things happening as a teacher. And so I guess both of those experiences together led me to wanting to pursue that as an academic, which is what I do now. And I continue to see those same things. I continue to see those same things playing out in school. And I guess my critical attention has changed a little bit. So my critical attention's always been about systems and about policies. Like, it's never been about individual teachers. It's never been about individual academics, although I'm
Yeah.
certainly critical of some individual academics. But the critique is of systems and ideologies and bigger system and policies rather than individuals. And really, I guess, like the conditions that teachers find themselves in, which puts them in a position where they might reproduce those things in their own practice. So the kind of pressures that teachers are under to reproduce some of those dominant ideas about language.
Do you think, in your experience, and also I suppose through your research as well, that things have changed in the last, say, 20 or 30 years from this point of view? So, I mean, because you say, these things are reproduced and you encounter and you have re-encountered them over and over again. Have things changed in any way, or have they remained more or less the same since you were a school kid?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I don't think they have changed that much, actually. No, no. I think there might be a greater like public and academic consciousness about linguistic inequality, and maybe that's the starting point towards like transformative systems change. So, but I don't think the underlying logics about language hierarchies and language ideologies, whether that be between languages or between varieties of languages,
Yeah,
I don't think those underlying logics and hierarchies have changed.
not
No,
that
I think,
much.
and I think that is the nature of discrimination, that it's continuously shifting, and that's why as critical researchers, we have to be very in tune with how those things shift over time. Because sometimes I think we can be tricked into thinking that things have changed for the better.
Yeah.
Yet sometimes I think we need to look a little bit deeper to really expose whether or not they have changed in any kind of meaningful way.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I tend to say, for example, to my students that in the UK generally, in the last, say, 40 or 50 years, attitudes towards accent variation and accents in general have changed for the better. And as an example, I talk about the BBC and the TV in general, where there was this expression BBC English, which was more or less synonymous to standard English. And now you hear a lot of more sort of diversity in terms of accents and so on TV. And to me, that kind of is an illustration of how attitudes may have changed over the last, say, again, 40, 50 years. But I'm still very much an outsider from that point of view. I'm kind of observing from the outside, and that's why I think your perspective is really valuable. And the other thing that I'm reflecting on as you were speaking is that when you said earlier that we're talking about language, but actually we're not. At least we're not only talking about language when we say discrimination. It's about race, and it's about social class, and it's about all kinds of other forms of discrimination. And you could almost argue that you are really talking about those things and using language as a kind of almost as a metaphor for those deeper
Yeah, yeah, sure.
social variables. And then, so on the one hand, you could say, and maybe tell me if this is true or not, that there's been generally a greater, let's say, tolerance or more positive attitudes towards uh, diversity in accents. Maybe on the one hand, this maybe have gone on in the last 40 years, but at the same time, from a social point of view, we are witnessing a worsening of disparities and inequality from other points of view as well, economic and so on. So you got these intersecting but also conflicting trends that have been going on. And that's why I wonder whether what you are saying, but things in terms of language attitudes in the school system have not really changed that much. And I wonder whether, I mean, it's very complex, but I wonder where the truth lies. Maybe superficially you say, oh, people are more okay about accents, but at the same time you have this deeper stuff going on in society, and some of these things are getting worse. And then where does language fit in all of that? It's really interesting, and I guess that's where you come in with your own research and your own reflections and your own work.
Yeah, I think there's a risk in like I totally agree that there is a greater diversity of representation of language styles, in terms of accents, especially on mainstream media. But there's also a risk, but representation doesn't mean equality, you know.
Sure.
There's a risk that people see that increased diversity of representation and make the assumption that that as a thing by itself is somehow addressing inequality. But
Right.
of course, what that does, it doesn't get to the root cause of inequality. So that's why I find things like equality, diversity, and inclusion statements,
Mhm.
like in universities, for example, quite problematic
Right.
because those statements exist, but they never fail. But they always fail really to address the root causes of discrimination and
Mhm.
marginalization. So you might see an equality, diversity, and inclusion policy within a university,
Yeah.
any of the universities that we work in, right?
Yes,
But at
absolutely.
the same time, the university is probably also complicit in race and gender pay gaps.
Yeah.
Universities are also quite ableist spaces. They can
Mhm.
be quite hostile spaces for people marginalized in all forms of different ways.
Mhm.
So it never addresses the kind of structural inequalities and discrimination
Mhm.
that lie at the very core and at the very root of these things. And so, like, I'm not like it's great to hear like different voices on the telly and stuff like that and on the
Yeah.
radio, whatever, but
Yeah.
I don't think we should equate that with um
Mhm.
yeah, structural inequality, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean. So in a way, what you're saying, well, I agree with that, is that these things perhaps sit more on the surface of things, including EDI statements and
Right, right.
policies, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's going on underneath that surface, the structural inequality, is a different matter.
Right. I
And
mean,
perhaps,
Sarah Ahmed talks a lot about that, right? And she writes about how the fact that it's often marginalized academics who put together those EDI are asked to put together those EDI statements,
mm,
yet they are still systematically discriminated against. So there's a kind of warped logic that often goes on there.
there's a warped logic, and also I suppose the risk is also, which is what you alluded to as well, is that by providing these statements, by making the surface look better, we are creating an illusion that what's underneath the surface is also getting better.
Right, right,
Right.
exactly, exactly.
And essentially, even your earlier statements about things haven't changed very much in terms of
Mm.
language attitudes in the school system.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
testimony to this, right? So the structural inequality is still there, even though
Yeah,
we're making the surface look better.
exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there is an increased awareness, I suppose, but maybe not. Actually, without maybe, there's quite a lot more that needs to be done. Um,
I think so, yeah. And you know, I see like a lot of work around accent bias in universities at the moment, and I've taken part in some of that work. And there's some
right.
brilliant work going on at Edinburgh, for example, and I know of emerging work here at MMU and at Leeds,
Yeah.
and I'm all in favour of that work.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of that really good work has also said, well, it's never just about accent bias; it's about addressing some of the structural
Right.
forms of inequality that pervade our institutions at the same time. So
Hmm.
yes, like giving like staff members or whatever, or school teachers training on linguistic diversity, I've got no issue with that. But you don't solve structural inequality
No.
by just modifying individual minds or like modifying the ways that individuals think about other individuals.
Hmm.
You tackle structural inequality by getting to the root causes of that. And
I mean,
you know,
this is really interesting because it reminds me of, I mean, in my area, which is world Englishes and varieties of English around the world, etc. There's been all this work about the equality of Englishes that has not often hasn't really looked at other forms of inequality. Again, sitting right beneath the, if
mm,
you like, the purely linguistic equality between, say, British English and Indian English or Nigerian English.
yeah,
And it's the same kind of thing, right? So
yeah,
you
yeah,
can argue and convincingly that British English is the same as Nigerian English from a linguistic point of view, and there's no doubt about that. But then the speakers of British English and the speakers of Nigerian English and the the very significant differences and inequalities that sit right beneath that is a different story. But then
right.
that leads me to the big question, which is, okay, so we are linguists, applied linguists, or even critical applied linguists. So what is it that we should do, right? The moment we recognize, well, we not it's not really about accents only, it's not really about dialects, it's not really about language ultimately, but it's about other stuff. Now we are linguists, so what do we do? You know what I mean? After we realize that all these narratives and all these attitudes, etc., aren't only about language, and can push it a little
Mm,
bit further and say they're not even at all about language, if you like. They seem to be, but they're not. So because we're linguists and our subject matter is language, what does it mean to be a critical applied linguist?
sure. That's a great question. Thanks, Mario. It's like often the one that I'm also asked as well. You know, people hear my critique and then they're like, yeah, but what should we do? Right. I mean, I guess the first thing to recognize is that there's no easy answer. Like what we're essentially talking about is theories of change for social justice, right? Like how do you build a theory of change which moves towards genuine structural social justice? So having that clear theory as your starting point is really, really important because if your starting point is working with a theory of social justice, which makes this assumption that systemic inequality can be solved purely through some kind of linguistic intervention, then your theory of change for social justice is inevitably flawed
Right.
because it's missing off what we call the structural determinants of oppression, right? So the big
Mm,
things like race and gender and poverty and access
mm,
to housing and education and your air quality, the climate crisis, etc. All of those structural determinants of oppression that include language all play an intersecting part in the different reasons why people are systemically marginalized and discriminated against. So like for me, like the strongest like social justice efforts are always ones that don't simply focus upon language itself. Because if you focus on language and language alone, then that's always going to be insufficient for
mm,
addressing and tackling the root causes of the ways in which different people are marginalized
mm,
across different times and
mm.
spaces. So as long as we have you know, like marginalized language practices are always going to be devalued and stigmatized, so long as uh, the speakers and the communities who use those languages are devalued and
Right.
stigmatized members of
Right.
society.
Right.
So for me, like a really important theory of change is one that that seeks to make connections between linguistic justice and social justice efforts more broadly.
Okay.
So And I think that actually there's been some really nice examples of this kind of work that we can all draw inspiration on from the past.
Mhm.
Another important thing to remember, like when we're engaging with social justice efforts and linguistic justice efforts, there's plenty of historical examples that we can draw immediate inspiration from. Like we shouldn't start from a kind of blank page as such.
Sure,
Actually,
sure.
those things have been trialed and tested and have had success before.
Mhm.
But crucially, I think where the most success has come from, it's come from often outside of academia.
Right.
It's come from spaces that have been led by communities that have experienced firsthand that marginalization.
Mhm.
It's come from communities who are engaged in grassroots organizing,
Mm.
in kind of genuine activist work,
Yeah,
in what we might call cross movement solidarity,
yeah.
right, where linguistic justice efforts takes place in dialogue with
Mm.
things like anti-stigma campaigning or anti-poverty campaigning or
Yeah.
racial justice efforts or disability justice efforts or climate justice efforts, right? We can all draw inspiration from different ways of thinking about how to approach social justice.
Yeah.
So, like, to get back to your question, like, as linguists, we can do loads of work, but we can't do that work by ourselves.
No. Okay.
Like, we have to do that in collaboration with
Right.
other movements for social justice in
So
order
that's
to.
crucial. Yes. So that's
I would think
fundamental,
so.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me,
Yeah.
that's crucial. Yeah.
Yeah. That essentially is the essence of what has been called now for the last sort of 10 years is research impact. It's even more than that, right? It's almost like working in conjunction with and in collaboration with and in symbiosis with the world outside academia. And all I was talking to other colleagues about this as well, and it takes a degree of, I suppose, humility and recognizing our roles and places as academics.
Mm.
Like you said, often the actual sources of social change, etc., take place outside or exist outside of academia. And from that point of view, we should sometimes, I guess, reconsider our own position and from a more humble position and from a more humble point of view and see ourselves as part of a larger movement and then reflect on what our role can be. I mean, I think you have done quite a lot of work in that sense, right? You've done quite a lot of work with communities, with teachers, and so on. And and I think that that's what all of us should be doing more, right? It's this kind of almost like reconsidering the role of the academic in society.
I agree. Like, I think it's a really important moment to consider that. And I think
Mm,
you have to consider like the types of working conditions that academics, certainly in England,
mm,
find themselves in at the moment. Um, where we exist in universities that are driven, often it feels, by metrics, by economic power, by league tables, by
yeah,
pressures to produce kind of rapid labor within very short
yeah,
cycles of time that are
yeah.
driven by the the Research Excellence Framework for
Hmm.
people outside of the UK. But also, like you say, this like increased impetus for academics to demonstrate some kind of material change in their local communities. But what I worry about that is that that kind of work can lead itself to quite hastily assembled so-called impact work, where
Mm.
the interests are really in the academic's heart
Yeah,
rather
yeah,
than the communities that we're claiming
yeah,
to,
yeah,
to work with, right? So,
yeah,
like, I think a critical perspective on the so-called impact agenda or the knowledge exchange agenda, or whatever you want to call it,
yeah,
is really important for critical applied linguists and indeed other people within our discipline to engage with.
mm,
Because if you get to the core of those things, then they often And they often result in very transmissive modes of knowledge dissemination, right, between expert and community or expert.
Mm.
They often reproduce like problematic power imbalances that
Sure.
are often like
Yeah.
colonially situated.
Hmm.
So different theories of justice ask us to think differently about how we collaborate with and who we collaborate with.
Yeah.
So for me, like a what we might call a transformative justice approach to applied linguistics would seek to like foster solidarity and collaboration with
Right.
communities
Right.
in ways which are maybe prioritized quite differently to how um, like the neoliberal university wants us to do our work, right? But that's really difficult if you're an academic and you're under pressure to produce all of this stuff, right? Especially when we look at the state of higher education in the UK and in other parts of the world as it is at the moment. So
Yeah.
there's a there's a pressure on academics, but there's also an ethical responsibility to do that work,
Yeah.
care, and with critical reflection at its heart, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what we are also saying is that talking about the research excellence framework and this sort of drive towards producing evidence of impact. I think what you're saying is that there is an element of instrumentality in that.
Yeah, yeah.
That tends to, so, you're expected as an academic to provide evidence that you have achieved impact in large, in, sort of in society, but ultimately that benefits you and the academic community more than it
Right.
does other people. And
Right.
it ends up being caught in this kind of logic of, of again, metrics and being assessed as a researcher and so on. And it's, and it reproduces it's a contorted kind of relationship in that sense.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah.
what we should be doing, I mean, I think if I've understood your words correctly, we should free ourselves from those parameters and think about impact and think about what we actually do in a more genuine and meaningful way. I mean, I think it's difficult to disentangle the two because from one point of view, you could say, well, I think it's good that there's greater emphasis on impact in general. I think the principle is valid
Mhm.
as long as we don't become too obsessed with with the where the outcome lies.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so we should keep in mind what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it, and it's a difficult one because we're under incredible degrees of pressure
Mhm.
to perform in an expected way,
Yeah,
and yes, and it kind of sometimes makes our work less meaningful from that point of view.
definitely.
There was something else I wanted to ask you as well. I mean, this conversation could very easily go on for a very long time because it's so interesting. But there's something else I wanted to ask you about this concept of racial linguistics. Could you explain it in a simple way what it means?
Yeah, so I actually don't really like the phrase ratio linguistics because I think and Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rose are two of the scholars that are really at the forefront of ideas about what we might call ratio linguistics. They
Yeah,
expressed some caution about the use of that word actually recently because they um they were writing about the use through the use of that word, then it becomes there's a risk that it's only ratio linguists, right, who get expected to do work on language and race. And the risk is then that other disciplines of linguistics, be it sociolinguistics or syntax or whatever, right, um, they see race as somehow falling outside the scope of their subdiscipline. So ratio linguistics is like, yeah, maybe a problematic word in that sense because it assumes that it's only the ratio linguists who do work on race and language.
yeah,
Right? So instead, I think it's more more productive to think about that concept in terms of two strands, so what they call ratio-linguistic ideologies and a ratio-linguistic perspective. And ratio-linguistic ideologies are just at their very core is just a very widespread and very, very durable and commonly held assumption and belief that racially marginalized or racialized communities use language in some way which is inherently deficient, right? It's kind of inherently substandard. And those ideologies persist no matter what racialized communities do with their language. So those ideologies and those beliefs about language are not about anything objective, but they're all about they're produced through how we perceive other people's language. And there's a very, very long history of where those beliefs and those ideologies about language come from. And they're tethered to European colonialism. Yeah. So lots of scholars before Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores did their pioneering work on racial linguistic ideologies, and so they're drawing upon some of that other work, have repeatedly showed that deficit and racist perceptions about language were a really central part of how European colonizers justified their colonial projects in terms of genocide, in terms of the stealing of land, in terms of indentured labor, etc. Right. And that those racialized communities, so Black African and indigenous communities in what is now called the Americas in particular, had their languages heard and represented as subhuman, as animal-like, as a mixture of animal and beast, etc., etc. So it's really important to remember that those racial-linguistic ideologies have a long and colonial history, and that those histories were those perceptions were integral to how European colonizers justified their project. So let me find an example. So in the book that I did last year, part of that work traced some of the way in which British colonizers perceived the language practices of Black African speakers. So this is from let me find the extract. I'm reading now from Edward Terry's book in 1655, and this is like one of the earliest forms of travel writing, right? So where British colonizers would go to different parts of the world uninvited, and write about what they saw and write about what they heard. So Edward Terry writes, we saw this he's writing about modern day South Africa, beasts in the skins of men, as they appeared by their ignorance, their habit, their language. For their speech, it seemed to us like an inarticulate noise rather than language. It seemed like the clucking of hens or like the gabbling of turkeys, and thus it was making a very strange and confused noise. So you see here how perceptions about language and how those speakers get framed as displaying language which is characteristic of them not being fully human. Yeah. And that's really, really important to what racial-linguistic ideologies are, because it disseminates this idea that through perceptions about their language, racialized communities through European colonialism then got framed as not fully human. Yeah. Okay, so and that took part in that was in conjunction with other racist perceptions about their culture, about their religion, about their clothing, about their sexual habits, etc., etc. But language was crucial to that.
So language, this particular representation of language was instrumental to the more general representation of the colonized as non-human. Not
right, human, exactly.
Right? They don't have a proper language, they don't have proper culture, they behave in a savage way.
Right.
And all these things. The whole idea of Africans don't write.
Right.
It was all part of that, wasn't it? And language. And what's also interesting about this is that how much of that really strong colonial mentality that went on for centuries somehow we still have echoes of that in now, right?
Right,
So the
right.
repercussions of that, which wasn't anecdotal. I mean, what you read was something that was much broader, much more common.
Yeah.
It was an illustration of something which was a very commonly held system of beliefs, and
Mm.
which went on for a very long time. And somehow we still inherit some of those ideas, even though
Absolutely.
they may not be so explicit
Absolutely.
and so
Yeah, yeah.
strong, but they still, yeah,
Right,
feed a lot
right.
of what we as societies,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And I think
experience.
that's what makes like what Rosa and Flores call a ratio-linguistic perspective so powerful. So a ratio-linguistic perspective is just simply a way of thinking about the co-production of language and race and the co-construction of linguistic and racial hierarchies
Hmm.
that were co-constructed at the same time and continue to be constructed in today's society. So a ratio-linguistic perspective takes from its starting point that those ideologies have a colonial history, and that in doing linguistic justice work,
Yeah,
we need to trace those colonial histories.
yeah,
Well, this gets back to a little bit about what we were saying earlier about, it's not just enough to like celebrate different variety of accents or whatever in different spaces
exactly.
if you're not acknowledging the colonial histories in which those hierarchies first came into being.
That's right.
So I'm all for work that challenges like accent discrimination or whatever, but that itself should be decolonial work. That should be
Hmm.
framed as a decolonial project because that's where you get to the very root of where those things were first designed and first came into being. And that's what a ratio linguistic perspective offers, at least on one level.
Yeah, yeah, not really interesting. Sometimes you hear people say, or critics of this whole idea, um, but colonization finished a long time ago. That's back in history, and I think one of our jobs, if you like to use that word, is to really bring to the fore the idea that colonization as a almost as a political endeavor may have finished, but the legacy is still with us.
Right. And it's not finished everywhere in the world, you
Well,
know,
that's true as
as
well.
we're seeing in parts of
Yes,
the world play out at the moment. So it feels like something that's in the past, but actually that past continues to shape the present.
the
Right.
past
So,
continues to shape the present. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
no,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a nice sort of ending to this conversation. I know that you need to go, Ian. So I really would like to thank you very much for this really interesting chat that we had.
thanks for inviting me.